Well, welcome back to the second podcast of this week as we're talking and continuing the conversation around the parable of the loving Father. And I say that intentionally because so many times, as Paul mentioned last week, we do put this in the negative of that which is lost. Ultimately, it's about the one who finds. And it's about the love of God that will not be stopped. And we need to remember that as we get into some of the nitty-gritty of this story of the younger son, because he's in a tight spot.
He's in a tight spot, and
right.
Oh, brother, we're out there, I said.
Yeah,
we're in
that's
a tight
right.
spot.
And I would like to just say, if you notice, we've got these great mugs here. This is a Huntersville United Methodist Church mug, but you know what? This is a Denver United Methodist Church mug. Much more substantial.
It
holds
is,
more coffee.
Yeah.
Name brand. What'd you get that off of? Like Oriental Trading?
We did. We got it off of
checking.
training, but it says whatever, and that's what I say to you right now. Whatever, Steve. Whatever.
But the reason and this is functional. This actually has coffee in it. Paul's is empty. It's a way of saying, his entire ministry. His entire ministry.
My
is a
cup
facade.
is empty. My cup is empty.
I just called you out. I've been waiting on that.
Yeah, younger brother. Why don't you go squander your possessions off
of
another?
Believe me, I've never had a ton of money at one time, but the few times I've had a little money, that urge to go just have a good time, to go, hey, I've got a couple $100. Let's just go.
If I've got 200, there's somebody else who's got 198, right?
Right, that's pretty much it.
Well, we left off yesterday talking a little bit about this younger brother. He's divided, he's taken, he's now squandered.
Yeah.
And it's reached a boiling point. We've reached rock bottom. He spent all his money, and he has to make one of those really difficult decisions in life that occasionally we have to make.
What's also interesting that the way Jesus tells the story is not he spent all of his money, but a famine hits the land. So some of this was within his control, right? He could have saved for that rainy day, but let's face it, when you're that age, and we take this as being a young man, you don't think those rainy days will come. But,
you don't think the recession will hit.
Right.
You don't think the economic crisis will hit.
Pandemic,
COVID, yeah, all
housing
that.
market will
crash and burn.
So he is caught, kind of out in the open, right? He's got nowhere to go, nothing to fall back on. He has no connections. He has no family connections and would have had no social connections. Remember, he goes to a distant land, which, as in the Jewish culture, would have meant away from the community. Mm-hmm. Whoever he did make friends with, as soon as the money's gone, you can guarantee they probably were gone too. And he finds himself in crisis. All kinds of crisis, not just one, right?
For the first time in his life, he's probably wondering, I don't know where my next meal is coming from.
Right. Yeah, he's grown up with plenty, luxury, but he finds himself in a crisis of his own making, which is the worst kind to find yourself in.
When you can beat yourself up and say, man.
If you're a victim of circumstances, then you can blame the circumstances. But if you've helped create the circumstance of your own brokenness, that's guilt, shame. Lots of stuff comes into that.
So for a young Jewish guy, he makes probably the most horrific decision one could be faced with. He's faced with the decision to go and take a job, as we would have said in my farm growing up, slopping pigs. If you know that vernacular, that's what you do with pigs, because pigs are some pretty nasty animals, I can tell you. And so he finds himself slopping pigs, and obviously in the Jewish context, they didn't eat pork. Pigs were considered unclean. Mm-hmm. This would have been the lowest of the low. Yeah. This would have been far worse than any janitorial kind of work.
Yeah.
Worse than hauling trash, anything. This would have been the lowest of the low.
Yeah, and Jesus tells it that way, just so you know. This is what the bottom looks like. And what's interesting about this young man in this story is he's not alone in biblical figures or characters who found themselves in places of distress and brokenness.
I think the Bible often portrays, maybe we fail to recognize just how often it requires us even to hit rock bottom before we can begin to find our way back up. Steve, we could go through a whole host of biblical stories and characters. Thank you for
put that back because I don't want you to feel inadequate.
Yeah, don't feel bad. Yeah, I think about King David, and that's one of my favorite stories in the scriptures from the standpoint of beginning to understand how God works. You can hit bottom, still be called David, as David was a man after God's own heart, but the story begins with David later in his life up on this balcony as he's looking out over his kingdom, and he spies this woman Bathsheba bathing. Oh man, he is full of power, authority. Bring that woman to me. He sleeps with her. She's pregnant. He invites her husband to come home from the front lines of the war in order to, he wants him to come home and sleep so he can cover up the pregnancy. He refuses to go home. How can I go?
He sleeps outside.
Sleeps outside when my buddies, my brothers are out fighting war. I'm not going home and sleep with my wife. So then David makes the decision. We'll just have him killed. And he does. He thinks he's gotten by with it until the prophet Nathan walks in and tells David this story about an owner who has one little sheep, and this other owner has flocks of sheep. And that owner of the flock of sheep says to the one, I'm taking even your one lamb.
Yeah, the poor man.
David is infuriated by this story. Tell me who this is. If this is real, I'll kill that man, David says. Nathan looks David in the eye and says, David, that's you.
Yeah, you are the man.
David hits rock bottom. He has been exposed
What's
as
fascinating
a fraud and all of that.
is you can still be the king and hit rock bottom.
Oh yeah,
right?
wherever.
I mean, so many times we think about hitting rock bottom like this prodigal. Like we think of rock bottom having lost everything. David hasn't lost everything. He's still the king, but yet he still finds the bottom.
But he's lost the most significant part of,
right.
He's lost himself.
He hasn't lost anything materially. And so many times we equate out what we have materially with our well-being. And there are people in our community who we look at and think, oh, they've got it made. And I think so many times we make that mistake, especially in a social media world where everybody's Facebook perfect or Instagram perfect or, all those things. And we look at what other people are and think, oh, they've got it made, and they have. No, that's not true. There are folks who are driving the nice cars, living in the nice houses, who are at rock bottom right now because of some level of brokenness in their lives.
And David writes in response to this rock bottom. He writes Psalm 51, which we read from time to time and try to remember the context. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin.
And we'll take a little bit more look at that next week when we talk about what it means to repent. Right?
Right.
But so many times it takes us to get to this, broken place in order to start seeing our need for God, our need to stop relying upon ourselves.
We sometimes it takes that hitting rock bottom to be able to see ourselves maybe for who we really are.
Yeah.
Other stories, Steve. The Bible's full of them.
Yeah, they are. It is certainly. Jacob finds himself in a place where he is utterly broken. When he is, if you remember the story of Jacob, he is quite the scoundrel, and there's some connection to this. If Isaac is going to pass on the blessing to his sons, right?
Youngest son.
He's got two sons.
Yeah.
Esau and Jacob snookers them. Jacob
cheats them.
Yeah, cheats them, steals the blessing effectively, and then has to run away from Esau.
Because Esau's a bad man who's going to kill him.
And eventually he makes his way back. And on the way back, he is, after years and years, he knows he's going to have to face his brother Esau. And he spends the night wrestling with God, an angel. It's a little unclear in the scripture, but he
pre-configured Jesus,
right? He just keeps, and it is a horrible, long, dark night of the soul for him, and he comes out of that limping.
and with a new name.
With a new name, he goes from Jacob to Israel. But he, that's a tough place, because he's like, I'm having to come back and reckon with the sins of my past. I'm having to come back and face my brother, who very well could kill me and all of my household. This is the ancient world. This isn't, it's not going to face a lawsuit. He could be facing the wrath of his brother that is very real. And he's having to deal with who he is, what he has done, and it's not a pretty moment for him.
Yeah, we can think about people like the Apostle Peter, denying Jesus 3 times, hitting rock bottom when he does it the 3rd time, and he looks over and Jesus looks him in the eye, and their eyes meet after this. Can you imagine the sense of despair and hitting rock bottom Peter would have felt in that? We can think about Judas, who had betrayed Jesus and saw no possible recourse other than to take his own life after having denied Jesus or sold him out.
Yeah. Well, and what these stories have in common, and I think what rock bottom means, is you don't see a future, or you can't see a future that has any good in it. Mm-hmm. When I think about hitting rock bottom, I think about someone falling, right, and landing face down. I don't know why in my mind they're always face down, but when you're face down on rock bottom, all you see is the rock.
Yeah, got to turn in order to see the right.
Right.
Well, that's a good stopping point for us today, as we invite you once again to reflect on the times maybe when you've hit rock bottom.
It may be now.
Yeah,
I mean,
it could be
very well. Who knows? God works in such amazing ways, and He even uses people like me and Paul, because God's got a strange sense of humor. And maybe you're at that point where you're thinking, I just don't see a future. All I see is I'm face down on the rock, and I don't see anything past this.
The cup may seem empty, but it can be refilled.
Yeah.
We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We're going to finish up this conversation tomorrow. I sure look forward to it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.